O daughters of Zion, O Abraham's sons, hear the words of your father, hear his promise of love. I will make you a blessing, so count the stars if you can. You will be a great nation. I will give you this land.
All right. This is the first session in a number that are really looking at Yahweh's prophecies. The prophecy that he makes to Israel. Has it been fulfilled continuously throughout history? And is it being continually fulfilled right up till today? That then opens another whole question. If it is, and he has kept those prophecies, then what happens after they are fulfilled? If they've been fulfilled up till today, what prophecies remain to be filled? That's really what we're going to look at as we go through this whole series. In the course of it, we will answer a few questions as well. Is Yahweh, and most people will call him God, is he really in control of the events in this world? You get a lot of people coming and saying, look, if there's really a God, and he's a God of love, then why are all these bad things happening? You see wars around the place, you see people starving and dying, you see so many diseases taking hold of large numbers of populations and places. Why is he allowing all this? This seminar will actually show you answers to some of those questions. And of course the other question that's often asked is, are we nearly at the end of this age? In which case, how close are we really to the return of Yeshua Messiah to establish his kingdom? In the course of it, we'll also touch on, of course, replacement theology. Is it right? Is it wrong? Has the church actually been the vehicle that's taken over from Israel? We'll be touching very briefly on the concept of the rapture. And of course, a big one for people who are starting to look carefully at the scriptures today, is the law, or the Torah, really done away with? Which a lot of course, Christian people will hold to, yes, it has. And we'll explain some of this as we go through. All right, if we are going to answer these questions, what we've got to do is this. First, we've got to look at the prophetic words themselves, or in other words, often the blessings or the promises that Yahweh has given to his people, Israel. Who through? Well, he's given them to Abraham, and some to continuation of that in Yitzhak, and then finally in Jacob. So if we don't know what those are, there's no way we can tell whether or not actually they've been fulfilled or not. So that's the first thing that we have to look at. Second thing we have to understand is, what is the real history of Yahweh's people? Israel. Because if we're going to see whether these prophecies and blessings have actually been true or not, we've got to know some history of his people. Unfortunately today, most history books will have very little about their history. And one could question whether that's by design or whether it's by accident. We'll have a look at that as we go through. All right? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the promises, which are effectively prophetic words to Abraham. Now, I'm sorry the words are a little small there, I'll read them out to you. First one happens in Genesis 12:3. Where Yahweh says to Abraham, I'll bless them that bless you and curse him who curses you. And then he ends up by saying, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Most people will translate it as. That same Hebrew word can be translated as mixed. There are two blessings or two prophetic promises here. One is that they will be blessed, and one is that they will be mixed. Both of them actually are operating. In Genesis 17:2, he says there, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. That's the second one we'll be looking at as we go through. In Genesis 17:4, Yahweh says to Abraham, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations." That's a third one. In Genesis 17:6, he again promises by saying, "I will make nations of you, and kings shall come out of you." Kings shall come out of you. What? Literally? We'll see that yes, that has happened. Genesis 17:7, it says, Yahweh says to Abraham, "I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you in their generations as an everlasting covenant." So anything promised to Abraham is promised to his seed, which is, of course, the generations that follow. Everlastingly. That means right down to today, if that is fulfilled. And again in Genesis 17:8, he says, "And I'll give to you and to your seed after you the land wherein you are a stranger, the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession." Genesis 21:12. And Yahweh said to Abraham, "For in Isaac shall your seed be called." Now, is that a promise that's been fulfilled? We'll find out. In Genesis 22:17, Abraham is promised, "Let your seed possess the gates of their enemies." What on earth does that mean? And if we can figure out what that means, has it been fulfilled? You know, Moshe gave a prophecy to all of Israel. And in that prophecy he said this, talked about the blessings and the curse which Yahweh had set before them. And then he said that you shall bring them back to your heart among all the Gentiles where Yahweh your Elohim drives you. And then in Deuteronomy 30 verse 3 he says, "And then Yahweh your Elohim shall turn back your captivity. He shall turn back and gather you from all the peoples wherein your Elohim has scattered you." And then in verse 30 verse 5 he says, "And Yahweh your Elohim shall bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it." So there's a whole lot of blessings or prophetic words that were given to Israel, either directly to Abraham, and hence Isaac and Jacob, or through Moshe to the whole of Israel. Excuse me. Then we have a number of blessings given through Jacob. In Genesis 48:16, Jacob says this, and he's talking to the two boys of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And the first thing he says in Genesis 48:5, once he's gathered them in front of them, he says he will bring them in as Reuben and Shimon. They are mine. Now Reuben and Shimon, remember, were the first and second born of those sons of Yaakov. But now he's bringing in Ephraim and Manasseh as Reuben and Shimon, in place of Reuben and Shimon. So he's putting them in as firstborn and secondborn. And then in Genesis 48:13 we know, and we've looked at this of course, how Yaakov's right hand goes on Ephraim and his left hand goes on Manasseh. And we read that in Genesis 48:13. And of course Joseph their father objected and said to his father, "You've got your hands the wrong way round." But Yaakov said, no, I know what I'm doing. In Genesis 48:16, there's a couple of verses later, Jacob says this over these boys. He said, "And let my name be called upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac." What was Yaakov's name changed to again? Israel. He's saying, let my name be called upon these two boys, and my names of my forefathers, effectively, Abraham and Yitzhak. And he goes on and says, let them increase in multitude in the midst of the earth. And then right at the end of this whole process, and we read this in Genesis 48:18, the father Jacob says this concerning these two boys. And first he speaks of Ephraim, the one with the right hand blessing. And he says, his younger brother is greater than he, meaning Manasseh. His seed is to become a multitude of nations. And of Manasseh he said, he also becomes a people when he is great. But the younger brother, Ephraim, is to become a multitude of nations. So what do we see from this? Two things. We know Manasseh was to become a people, a great people. But Ephraim was to become a multitude of nations. There's a difference between those two. Later on, Jacob gathered his sons together and gave them prophecies. Every one of those sons got a prophecy. And he said to them, I want you to gather around me because I want to give you some prophecies that are foretelling what will become of you in the last days. We read this in Genesis 49. Because he says to them in Genesis 49 verse 1, gather together so that I can declare to you what is to befall you in the last days. Now that has a huge implication because that means that all of these tribes must still be present in the last days for those prophecies to be fulfilled, does it not? Okay. And we're in the last days. That means all of those that are descended from those sons of Jacob must be present somehow on this earth today. So we're going to start all this by looking at the history of the nation of Israel. Much of this history you will not find in history books. It appears to have been deliberately suppressed. First of all, when the children of Israel came into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, the land was already occupied by quite a number of other small empires, or nations we should say. Up in the north we have the Hittite Empire, we have Assyria, we have Babylonia in the purple colour there, Egypt over here. The land came in and was taken under Joshua and then through the time of Judges. During that time, do you realise that Yahweh was the king over Israel himself? The dates for that were around 1400 BC through to about 1040 BC. Actually, during that time of the Judges, there was also a group of people who were called the Sea Peoples. And they were invading the Mediterranean coast shores. And again, this was around about the 13 through to about the 1200 BC point. We know Israel's first king was King Saul, anointed by Samuel. And this is back in again about 1043 BC. So King Saul died in a battle against the Philistines in 1010 BC. King David, who was anointed by Saul a bit earlier, in 1025 BC, 18 years later, when Saul died, David became king. Now, David became king in 1010 BC. That's quite significant, as we'll see. When the people came into the land, when it was taken under Joshua, each tribe was given a portion of the land. It's important to get an idea of where they were. Manasseh was a huge tribe, very large in number. And so Manasseh was given two portions. Here's the Jordan River, and Manasseh was given a portion on the west side and on the east side. Under Manasseh we have Gad, and then down here we have Reuben. So those tribes were on the east side of the Jordan. All the other tribes were on the west side of the Jordan. up here. There's one place here, Dan, indicated here just on the coast. They were a very seafaring tribe. They also had another small amount, we haven't got it on the map, right up in the north that they took. So they were split into two small portions. So we have a portion of Israel on one side of the Jordan and another portion on the other side of the Jordan, with one tribe being split in half, and that was Manasseh. Okay? Just remember those ones that are on this side. Half of Manasseh, all right, Gad and Reuben. Also keep in mind, as we just mentioned, Dan has two portions, one here and one that they took right up in the north again later. That's going to be important because we will see what Yahweh has done through history with these peoples. Okay, King David's rule. Let's have a look. King David ruled from 110 BC to about 970 BC. First of all, he became king only over part of Israel, which was the lower part, which we now call the Kingdom of Judah. Later on, the others in the north came and said, we want you to be king over us too. So eventually David became king over both the Kingdom of Israel in the north and the Kingdom of Judah in the south. Before all that, there was actually a 7.5-year war between Judah and Israel in the north. A lot of times there were civil wars between these two kingdoms. But after that was when David became king over the whole area. And we read that in 2 Samuel. When David became king over Israel, his army was this big, 1,570,000 men. That's a huge army. We read that in 1 Chronicles 21. And during David's rule, he expanded the borders. He actually conquered many of the kingdoms that you can sort of see around the borders here. He conquered many of these kingdoms down here. Ammon, Moab, Edom, the Arameans in the north. The Assyrian Empire was quite dominant when David became king. And so David's rule actually brought the empire of Assyria down. It collapsed. And it became one of the areas that David ruled over. So effectively he ended up ruling over the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Syrians, that's the Arameans, as well as conquering Assyria. It's quite a large area. That's the area that David's kingdom covered. From the small beginnings, he conquered all those areas. The other nations were called vassal nations. Now, what's a vassal nation? Well, a vassal nation is one that has some autonomy. In other words, there's a ruler put in place there, but they actually have to give tribute to the nation that conquered them. So in this case, many of those that David conquered, those nations around the east side of his kingdom, had to give tribute to David. There were rulers in place, but they were underling rulers, if you like, under David. One of these was getting a bit miffed about being a vassal nation, didn't want to pay the tribute, and that was the Arameans. The Ammonites. The Ammonites then decided, righto, they're going to revolt against David, but they were pretty small. They were being actually advised and helped by the Assyrians. The Assyrians, of course, were pretty upset at being conquered by David. So they said to the Ammonites, hey, look, you start revolting and we'll sort of provide some mercenaries to help you. Ultimately, the idea, of course, was Assyria wanted to come in and reconquer the lands they'd lost to David and even take over the area that David had. So it was like you revolt and we'll just give a show of force, but we'll actually come in and give you a major hand in it. So that's what it was all about. The Ammonite army, and you can read this in 1 Chronicles 19. There's a whole description there about the battle that took place. These Ammonites provoked the war with David. They had an ally in this other partially conquered nation of Assyria, who else came into the party? Well, the Babylonians came in, the Arameans came in, which are often called Syrians in the scriptures. And of course, Assyria was the major power before this. So these were all coming against David. When David found out about it, he found out that in fact their plans were to fight it in two stages. And the first one was about 990 BC. And again, you'll find it in 1 Chronicles 19. So David divided his army into two and battled on both fronts because they were coming at him in two directions. His army actually won that stage of the war. After a brief respite, the Assyrians decided, well, we'll get their whole army into this, and so they came back again. And they brought all their army into it. And all of Israel mobilised its army totally and fully too. And they attacked each other with complete resources they had. If you want to read the results of that, read Psalm 83. Psalm 83 is where David writes of the battle that he won decisively. So from that time onward, Assyria declined and went into often what's called severe poverty, while Israel rose to power. But Israel actually had some allies in two city-states. One was called Tyre and one was called Sidon. These were the Phoenicians. Phoenicians spoke exactly the same language as did Israel. So while this Israel and Phoenicia rose to dominance in the whole world, Assyria declined even further, and it stayed in that declined state right through until the end of Solomon's reign. So we have a large kingdom under David and later on under Solomon, who extended it, and Assyria with no real influence in the area at all. So David made this alliance with the Phoenician cities after this battle. You might have recalled the King Hiram helping Solomon later. Also, the Phoenician people were very helpful because the Phoenicians already had huge fleets of ships. And they were trading around the world. They spoke the same language, so they worked well with the Israelites. They were controlling all the sea routes, everywhere. And of course, they taught the Israelites the skills of sailing. But also, David controlled all the land routes. All the trade over land from Asia and so on had to come in via David's controlled areas with the army. Any sea trading had to come in by the Phoenicians. So Israel and Phoenicia together actually controlled every trading area and route in the world at that time. Effectively, they had become a global commercial empire. Now we know David gathered many materials for building the temple, but he wasn't allowed to build it. His son, remember, was the one who would build it. There was a prophet at the time who came to David and said this in 2 Samuel 7:9. This is what he said to David. Yahweh speaking, "And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and have made you a great name, like the name of the great ones who are on the earth." This was exactly fulfilled in David's lifetime. David had no other threats to him anywhere. He was the dominant king of his time, and he ruled effectively what we would today call a superpower. He had no enemies at all, just as this prophet had told him. This continued through the time of Solomon. There were no enemies in either David's time or Solomon's time. So after David died, Solomon became king, 970 BC to 931 BC. He still ruled over all of Israel, although it's interesting, both of them still called themselves by separate names. There's still Judah and Israel mentioned there. King Hiram was still the king of one of the Phoenician city-states, and he continued his alliance with Solomon as he had with David. In fact, he provided workers to help build the temple with all the materials that David had gathered. In fact, during the construction, we read in 1 Kings 5 that there were 30,000 workers from Phoenicia working as labourers. The Israelite Phoenician Empire, I guess we could say, ruled over all the ancient world. In history books you will find it's always called the Phoenician Empire, but the predominant power in it was Israel. So it's Israel and Phoenicia, really. The extent of Solomon's kingdom grew substantially. You see in the purple there, all around this portion, right up here. Greatly enlarged. So by this time we have the whole Phoenician-Israelite alliance controlling all the world trade. Phoenicians the sea, Israel the land. All over Asia and everything up to the north. In fact, there was even an ancient waterway constructed. Do you remember the Suez Canal? It was actually constructed long before the one we know. It was first constructed by Egypt in about 1380 BC. Connected the Nile River with the Red Sea, and it was used by their ships. The Phoenicians used the same thing. Add to the world's dominance, you might recall one of Solomon's wives was an Egyptian, and we read that in 1 Kings 3. So the Egyptian decided to join this alliance of Phoenicia and Israel. So you had Egypt, Phoenicia and Israel all together making control of everything. Hardly surprising that we end up with getting native Fijians claiming their lineage comes from Egypt, well, from Africa. We'll see more about that later. Actually, the ruling pharaoh at the time that the daughter was given to Solomon as one of his wives actually gave Solomon a city as a dowry. Pretty good dowry. A whole city, people and all. So what do we end up with at the end of all this? We end up with this. We have 3 nations ruling the whole world until the end of Solomon's death. It was the only economic and military power in the world for centuries. And often it's called the Golden Age of Israel, because Solomon, of course, ruled every country. What was it all for? It was for trade. There was no other nation that would challenge them. On land or sea, come to that. There was so much riches from first the wars that had happened, of course, but also all the tributes from many other nations that were coming in. Many other countries were pouring materials in, particularly into Solomon. Many of them, of course, coming in through overseas by the Phoenician ships. So David had gathered many, many materials that Solomon was able to start and use to build the structures. One of the things he'd managed to get was huge amounts of copper ore. You know, an ore has got copper in some form that you have to get the copper metal out, so you've got to do things to it. So you've got to refine it. In other words, you've got to put a lot of heat onto it to get the metal out. Well, it appears David had refined this ore to get the actual copper metal. We know he brought cedar wood from Lebanon, and gold and silver was somewhere else overseas. In fact, 1 Chronicles 29 tells us that iron ore was more common than copper, and yet we still find no copper mines anywhere in the Middle East, even to this day. There have never been copper mines in the Middle East. So where did he get all this from? Where did he get the silver from? Where did he get the copper from? Let's have a look at where the Phoenicians were able to go. The Phoenician, well, let's call them Israelite and Phoenician, because that's what they were. They sailed not only in the Mediterranean Sea, but they also went out through to the Atlantic Ocean. They controlled the sea access through the Straits of Gibraltar. No other nation sailing could get beyond the Mediterranean. Any other nation sailing ships were confined into the Mediterranean Sea area. That access to them getting out was closed for centuries. Only the Phoenician ships would be able to get out. Here's a prophecy that was given by Jacob, that they would possess the gates of their enemies. Gibraltar is one of those gates. No one else could actually get access to get out, and Phoenicia and Israel controlled them. But they went elsewhere too, as you'll see there. They not only went out the Straits of Gibraltar, but they went into North America, and they went into South America, and also through the straits into the Red Sea. So they came out into the Indian Ocean and around that way as well. All of these places were being sailed to. Long, long before we have indications of other empires sailing those routes. In fact, the Phoenicians guarded those routes very jealously. Now remember, a lot of this was trade. So that meant they had to have means of loading and unloading ships in the places they went to. So the global empire of Israel and Phoenicia set up colonies in a whole heap of places to handle the ships that were coming in. So there were colonies of Israelites and Phoenicians together, particularly Israelites, in places like Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, Italy, North Africa, Spain, the British Isles, along the coast of France, in Norway and in Scandinavia, and even in the Caucasus Mountains areas, which is up north by the Black Sea. There's a few of them. They had colonies running all around the coast of, this is the top of Africa, not so much in Italy, a few here, there's a few in Greece, here's Spain, a few more against the coast of Spain, which were part of the colony around the top of North Africa. And that's only in the Mediterranean area. They had colonies in many of the other areas as well. What were they all for? Well, as we said, they were for trade. For example, tin was mined in the Cornwall area of Britain. And that tin ore was brought back because it's actually used with copper to make bronze. So they needed the tin. But where did they get the copper from? Well, there's still a major mystery even today for archaeologists in the US, because around the north of North America, around Lake Superior, there are about 5,000 copper mines totally worked out. There's no more ore there. But the archaeologists have got a real problem because nowhere in North America are there copper items. There has nothing ever been made out of copper in North America. Where did all the copper ore go? Well, we know where it went. There's a pier in Maine that's actually got Phoenician writing on it, where the ships used to dock, load the stuff in, take it back to Israel. All those mines were dated about 1000 BC to 2000 BC. When did we say David and Solomon ruled? About 1010 BC to about 930 BC. The dates fit really well. Copper ore was brought back to David. Another interesting thing is, iron was brought in from Brazil. In Hebrew, BRZL in English, but if we put that into Hebrew letters, is the Hebrew word for iron. Even today, Brazil is one of the major iron producing countries. So here is a country, Brazil, still called the land of iron, the Hebrew word. Where did the Israelites get the iron from? From Brazil. It was all used and brought back. What about the silver? So much silver, in fact, was used in Solomon's kingdom that it was considered of virtually no value. It was just literally everywhere. Where did it come from? Well, when we start looking at what Solomon used, all the drinking vessels in Solomon's kingdom, well, at least in his palace, were of gold. There's another place called the House of the Forest of Lebanon, and everything in there was gold as well. Not silver, had to be gold. Silver wasn't worth it. In 1 Kings 10:2, we read this: "For the sovereign had ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and baboons." Tarshish is the southern region of Spain. It was the colony of Israel that was established there to handle the ships. In fact, the whole of the Spanish peninsula there was originally called Iberia. Now, Eber was the last patriarch of Shem's progeny and sons to die. And so that's where that name came from. And that's why all the rivers in Spain, even today, you'll see were known once as, and are still recorded as being once as, rivers called Iberias, Iber, even one called Tamaris, which is after King David's daughter, Tamar. And you even hear this area referred to by Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 27, and Jonah. Remember, Jonah didn't want to give a word to Nineveh, and he ran away where to? Tarshish. Exactly the opposite. Nineveh is in Assyria, the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Where was Jonah going? To Tarshish, Spain. Exactly the opposite way. He didn't want to give a word to Nineveh at all. Tarshish is the Spanish area. And Spain had extremely productive silver mines. So where do you think the silver came from? There's also confirmation about the metal ores being brought into Israel, because there's one of the biggest smelting, you know what smelting is? Where you heat the ore with the likes of coke and so on to get the metal out. But you need a lot of heat. Well, in Israel, at a place called Ezion Geber, there are still ruins there of massive big smelting furnaces, built so that the prevailing wind would actually be a draft going through them. And it's right near a shipping dock where metal ores can be offloaded and then put into the smelting system to make the metals. They had a huge industry going. There were actually many, many advances during the time of Solomon's reign. No surprising, of course, because Yahweh says he was the wisest man who had ever lived. But he designed these metal furnaces, these blast furnaces for producing the metals. But also around 1000 BC, which is Solomon's kingdom time, you get all sorts of new designs in pottery. Hadn't been anywhere like that before. They started being picked up by other cultures, but they started there. Also, you find around 1000 BC, Egyptian writings reached their highest point of, how shall we say, describing how people should relate together. And they included many Hebrew proverbs. I wonder where they got them from. Not really, no. But the interesting thing that really came out at this time is, for the first time ever, there was a phonetic alphabet. Before that, alphabets used to have signs. We still have them today in like Japanese and Chinese. But now we suddenly see developed in Israel a phonetic alphabet where the alphabetical letters gave you a sound. So instead of just writing a symbol to express some sort of object or idea, now you have a series of sounds that you can put down from the letters. And it became much more efficient and easier to use, and eventually that alphabet became the national language of commerce, which was Phoenician Hebrew. Even the Greeks and the Romans actually acknowledged that they learned their alphabet from the Israelites, or Phoenicians. In their writings they acknowledged that. Yahweh said to Solomon, "See, I shall do according to your words. See, I shall give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like you before you, and none like you shall arise after you." No one's ever been wiser than Solomon even down to today, in spite of what many out there might think they are. He did so many things. We think Archimedes and those sort of people are so good. Solomon had so many projects that he did and wrote far beyond those guys. It's quite significant too that the Phoenician, Hebrew, Moabite, North Aramean, that's the Syrian in Scripture often, languages are all pretty much the same. And King Solomon ruled over all of those people. So literally, they all were able to talk to each other without any translator. And many, many people around the world were sending tributes to Solomon to get his favour. And as Scripture actually says, and literally it was true, all the earth was seeking Solomon's wisdom. What are some of the characteristics of Solomon's rule? Well, royal visits from other kings were actually very common. You get a huge amount of gold and precious metals coming in there, because one of the things that kings always liked to give another king was gold, of course. It was the most prestigious gift you could give another. And at least, we read in 2 Chronicles 9, that at least 666 talents of gold each year came into Solomon's kingdom. That's a lot of gold when you think 75 pounds is 1 talent. All the kings we know too from 2 Chronicles 9 came to visit Solomon year by year. In other words, once a year. Significant. Remember that. That'll become important later as we go through. All kings came once per year to visit him. And we know Solomon was interested in effectively the whole of creation, because he had all sorts of trees and shrubs and plants and animals and so on from around the world. He built zoos, he had gardens. It was just incredible. But all this is a picture of the rule of Messiah Yeshua to come. Because why? Well, let's look at it. Solomon ruled in a time of widespread peace. What do we celebrate on Shabbat? But a coming rule of 1,000 years of peace. Solomon ruled in a time of peace. He reigned in Jerusalem. So does Yeshua. He was greater than any other king of his time in the world. And that'll be true of Yeshua as well. But before he came to power, there were some major wars. Big wars. We're going to see the same thing. We're also told all this gold and silver and so much of the world's wealth flowed into Jerusalem. We will see exactly the same again, and that's prophesied too under Yeshua's rule. And the world kings came to Jerusalem once a year. Wonder why? Wonder if it was for the Feast of Sukkot. That's what we're told for Yeshua's rule, isn't it not? So, here's some of the history of the kingdom of David and Solomon that we don't see greatly at all. What we're going to do in the next session is we'll have a look at what happens to Israel after David and Solomon's rule. Were there any other prophecies that were fulfilled in their history? We will see in the next session.
Though your sins were like scarlet, they'll be whiter than snow.